Hi Prep 2, I wish your day is fine. We are here together again with David, and this is one of my best moments, by the way. Here I can bring for you the poster of David Copperfield's movie to remind you that you can search for this movie and you can see everything happen with David, not just by reading and not just by listening the audio. You can see everything happen with him by this movie. So before we start chapter 3, you can ask yourself some questions to revise what happened with David in chapter 2. We have some pictures to remind you what happened with him and to answer the questions. Question number 1, what was Biggiety's message to David? Do you remember? How long was David locked in his room? From these pictures you can remember what happened with David in chapter 2. David was always sitting with his mom, studying and spending all the time together. But when he was older, something changed in his studying. Mr. Murdstone and Miss Murdstone were sitting all the time with them in the same room. He was holding a stick. He was looking at David all the time. It was so bad for David. He was unlucky. He couldn't remember anything from his studying. Mr. Murdstone started hitting David in his room with a large stick, and he was locked in his room. And then he was sent to a boarding school called Salem House. If you want to remember what happened with David in the school and what about his friends and like that, you can just read chapter 2 again to remember. So question number 1, what was Biggiety's message to David while he was locked in his room? The message was that they were going to send him away to a boarding school the following day. So Biggity sent a message when David was locked in his room. She sent a message secretly to tell him that the following day he would be sent to a boarding school which is called Salem House. Question number 2, how long was David locked in his room? Do you remember? Yes. He was locked there for 5 days and nights. How miserable David was. So we remembered some events happened in chapter 2, so we are ready to go for chapter 3, and then we will see what happened with David. Unfortunately, this chapter started with some bad news for David. After 2 months in Salem House, it was his birthday. But in that day, he listened to the worst news in his life. Mrs. Crackle told him that his mother was so ill, and she told him that we all should accept that our loved ones can die at any moment. By the way, Mrs. Crackle is the manager's wife, Mr. Crackle, and on David's birthday he was asked to go to Mr. Crackle's office. And while he was going, he was just thinking about his birthday. Of course, Biggity sent me something in my birthday. Of course, there is a present. He was so happy and he was expecting everything will be good. But when he arrived, he found sad faces. Mrs. Crackle started to tell him something. She started to tell him something made him so worried. She said to him that we need to remember that our loved ones can die at any moment. David was trying to realize her words. Then he heard her saying, "Your mother is dead." He started sobbing and he couldn't do anything. He just packed his bags, going back to his home. When he met Biggity at the door, they cried in each other's arms, and Biggity told him that his mom was so ill for a long time, and she got worse after his baby brother was born, and that the Murdstones often spoke to her crossly and made her sad all the time. But Mrs. Clara was so kind with them, and one day she died like a child, going to sleep. After his mother's funeral, the Murdstones told Biggity to leave, and she wouldn't be their servant anymore. She was deeply sad, but she decided to go to her brother Daniel, and she took David with her for a holiday, just to make David forget some of his sadness. When they arrived and they met Daniel, Ham, and Emily again, he found that Emily is older and changed a little. He told them about his school and his friends, especially the handsome, clever Steerforth. Don't forget this name. In these days, Mr. Parks was a frequent visitor, and then Biggity had decided to accept his offer and finally to marry him. Do you remember Parks' wedding? When David came back to his house, the Murdstones weren't happy, of course. They weren't happy to see him, and they were trying to find any way of sending him away from the house. They finally arranged for David to start work. Yes, a 10-year-old child is starting to work at that age, just because the Murdstone decided that his school is too expensive and they wanted to control everything. David was sent to London to work in a warehouse. His job was to wash bottles of wine or to pack the bottles in cases. He was paid 6 shillings a week. He can't describe how shocked and afraid he was, and the horror he felt. In his first day, he was sent to the manager's office. Of course, he was afraid, and there he met Mr. Micawber. Again, Mr. Micawber. Yes, you didn't hear this name before that, but now you need to know that Mr. Micawber is the person who offered David a spare room in his house, and he lived with Mr. Micawber and his wife and their kids in a very small house with old furniture. They were very poor and earned a little money, and David knew that Mr. Micawber owed a lot of money, and his creditors were waiting him at the door all the time. And they went to the police to take their money from Mr. Micawber. So one day the police arrested Mr. Micawber for his debt. He spent several weeks in prison while David was visiting him all the time, trying to help Mr. Micawber's family, and he was spending a lot of time with Mr. Micawber, visiting him. And by the way, Mr. Cooper said to him a great sentence. You can find it while reading the chapter. So, after some weeks, Mr. Cooper was free. It was very good news for David, but it was also bad news because the Coopers decided to leave their house and to move to another place, which means for David that he must have another way to make his life better. He decided to try to find the only one he knew of his family, the only surviving relation in his family. He needs to make his life better. He needs to find someone help him. He will use the money Biggity gave him to try to find his only one in his family. He didn't know anything about her except that she lived somewhere near Denver. He will use the little money that Biggity gave him to try to find his aunt. Do you remember her name? Yes, Miss Betsy Trotwood. Would he be able to find her? And if he found her, would she welcome him? Or she would accept him as she didn't accept him as a baby? If you ask yourself these questions, I'll tell you that these are the answers that we will know next chapter in detail. So before I finish this session, I just want to ask you some questions to check this chapter. So you can look at these questions and try to answer them after reading the chapter, just to be sure of your answers. First question is, how did David feel when Mr. Creakle wanted to see him? Do you remember? When he was thinking about his birthday gift and like that. What news did David receive on his birthday? Was it good or bad news? What happened to David after his mother's funeral? Do you remember what happened to Biggity and David after the funeral? Question number 4. What was David's new job when he was sent to London in the warehouse? What was his job? What did David decide to do in order to make a better life for himself? After Mr. Cooper's leaving from his house, David was in a lot of need to make his better life. So, do you remember what would he think to do to make his life better? He will search for someone. I will not tell you the answer. And the last question here, comment. And by the way, this is a quotation from the chapter, and you can't answer without reading the chapter. You need to read the chapter to find who said this quotation to whom, and when was it said, and where, and like that. So the quotation is, I hope my mistake will be a warning to a young people like you. Again, the quotation is, I hope my mistake will be a warning to young people like you. Try to guess who said this sentence to whom, and you will not be sure except you are reading the chapter. At this point, we can say that we talked about what happened in chapter 3. We talked about David's life in London and how he spent his life working as a child with 10 years old. And we stopped at that part. David needed to make his life better. He will search for his aunt, even he doesn't know anything about her, except that she is the only person in his family he knows. So next chapter we will see what happened with David. Did he find his aunt? And what happened with them? Would she welcome him, or she would refuse him as she refused him as a baby? So at this point I can say that this video is finished. I wish everything is clear for you. Next time wait for me, and I'm waiting for you.